Well, good morning, everyone. It's a glorious Tuesday, isn't it? I'm so excited and happy that you've decided to join us for daily devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship, whether you're accessing us through YouTube or through a podcast. It's wonderful that you've taken the time to join us today. If you haven't met me before, my name is Dan. I'm a teaching pastor here at Redeeming Life Fellowship, and we're going to continue this journey through this Revive School reading plan. I can't believe I'm actually still saying that. It still rolls off the tongue after a year of repeating that. But no, our Redeeming Life reading plan that's been leading us through the New Testament over the course of a year. And today marks a significant transition as we've gone through the Gospels. And just yesterday, we looked at Paul and his journey throughout basically the known world and going on missionary journeys, not just spreading the gospel wherever it goes, but also doing work to nurture the gospel he's going as a missionary, but also going as a pastor throughout the known world to not just proclaim the good news, but to see to it that the good news goes to seed into people's lives and it brings forth the sort of fruit of righteousness and holiness and life and joy and godliness that God desires for each and every one of us. And Acts is the drama where we see all of that unfold. And as Luke shows us what's happened, not just when Paul's doing it, but when Peter's doing it, when Apollos is doing it, and Priscilla and Aquila and Timothy and all these key historical figures in the early church, how God uses them in profound and mighty ways to bring about God's purposes for these people, for Jews and Gentiles alike, that the good news of the gospel isn't just about this Jewish thing, it's not just about this Gentile thing, it's about this human thing. But we are not here to talk about Acts because we just finished it yesterday, so I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to take another sip of coffee. But what this means is that today is the introduction to the book of Romans. And we're going to be merely touching on, as far as the reading plan is concerned, merely touching on Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, which is only what you would call the epistolatory greeting, the sort of formal, hello, how are you doing? I love you. This is why I think you're the best. And before you ever get to the body of the passage. And so there's a lot to actually glean from something like this, namely, in Romans, at the very end of this epistolatory greeting, you're going to find Paul's thesis statement. That is what Romans, if you could condense it down to just like one thing, his argument and the thing that he's going to defend and he's going to explain, he's going to unpack in detail throughout the rest of the book, because Romans is pretty big. It is the longest, the most thoroughgoing theological treatise that Paul has to offer us. And that's one of the reasons why it is so important, and also why it actually has a way of inviting certain, not controversy isn't the right word, rather the Paul, as he's probing theological depths, also brings with it a whole lot of questions and a lot of things that clearly Paul has been wrestling with, whether he's been arguing and defending the gospel from synagogue to synagogue and even into the pagan public marketplaces. Wherever he's going, he's not just sharing the gospel, but he's also defending the gospel. And it seems like a book like Romans is almost like a culminating piece of all the sort of work that he's been doing and facing a lot of the regular questions that he's been doing throughout all these missionary journeys, that all of this stands behind a book like Romans. But before we get into that, we're going to do a little bit of introductory framework on what you're going to find in a book like Romans. But also, the thing that we'll have to remember is that according to this reading plan, by today, July 19th, all the way through December 3rd, each and every book that we're going to deal with, we're going to read with, is an epistle. That's a fancy word, that this is a letter that constitutes the majority of the body of the whole New Testament, most of the New Testament writings, by a pretty significant margin, are all epistles. They're all letters. And so what I wanted to do is offer some quick tools, some useful tools, things that are helpful to remember when you're sitting down to read an epistle, when you're sitting down to read a letter of the New Testament. And now, something to remember about this is that epistles, as letters, they're letters that are addressed in every circumstance to the early church. And that can be either individually or collectively. So in books like Timothy and Titus and 3 John, those additional those letters, are addressed to leaders or specific people within the early church, particular individuals. Or, as in this case, like the book of Romans, it is addressed to individual or to the church collectively, or as it may be in some cases, if the city is large enough, multiple congregations who are spread throughout the city. And so that when Paul is sitting down to write, he's writing to people who are already Christians, people who have heard the good news of Jesus Christ. They've heard about his ministry. They've heard about most likely his baptism, and they've accepted the good news of Jesus Christ through faith and have been baptized. And as Paul or Peter or John are writing these epistles to the churches, whether individually or collectively, remember, they're writing to them in a way that is to nurture the faith that they already have. That in large part, whenever we're sitting down to read an epistle, that the epistles are of all the letters the most pastoral. In other words, as they're sitting down to write, the motivation behind writing these sorts of things to these Christians is to do so from the role of a pastor who's trying to not merely to persuade anybody to the faith, but rather, how is it that they're writing to nurture the faith that they already have? So up to this point, that means that's one of the reasons why in the epistles you're going to find a lot of imperatives, a lot of commands, where in the epistles you're going to see in this picture how it is that right faith or orthodoxy influences right practice, orthopraxy, where there is this relationship about how it is that right faith influences right practice. And that it's not just merely about believing the right things, but because you're believing the right things, that's going to influence or shape or inform the right sort of action that we're supposed to reflect, namely through an example of Christ, as Paul would write about in Corinthians, but that the epistles indeed are about both orthodoxy and orthopraxy, helping the church to root themselves in right beliefs so that the fruit of those right beliefs are going to be right practice. And so that's one of the things to remember about the epistles, and also to remember that the epistles, they function as a surrogate for the apostle or the writers, a surrogate for their actual presence and authority. So in other words, as we've just read through a book like Acts, where Paul is going around the known world and sharing the gospel everywhere, and knows that he cannot be everywhere at once at the same time. That that even as he's going through and not just spreading the gospel to churches, but revisiting churches and teaching them and wanting them to be able to grow and mature in their faith. Paul is a person who's growing mature disciples throughout his work, throughout the ancient world, but that he's getting to the point, certainly, where, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. He knows that he can't be everywhere at once, but what he can do is write letters, in which case he can command, he can exhort, he can correct, he can encourage, all through a letter. But here's the genius of what he's doing. As we'll find out, or reading in an epistle like Colossians, where there's this little subscript that's been preserved in the letter to Colossians, where Paul instructs the letters of Colossians to copy the letter and send it to the church in Laodicea, and to ask the church of Laodicea copy their letter and send it back to Colossians, so that what Paul is instructing them to do, and to help them along as accustom, to say, here, I'll write this as a pastoral letter to this church in, say, Ephesus, or to the region of Galatia. And what those churches can do is copy those certain letters and then be able to disseminate them to other churches, so that Paul can have this multiplying influence of pastoral influence over all of these churches that he's visited, and even churches that he hasn't visited, like the church in Rome, where by the time that Paul is writing it, he's writing it to a church that he's never been to. That each of these churches can have this multiplying and nourishing effect of copying the letters that Paul is writing and sharing them and spreading them around to these different churches, so that the pastoral work and the effect of the pastoral shepherding can be multiplied across a wide area that Paul could never have done if all that they were depending on was his physical presence among them. So, yes, the epistles are, as they're rightly called by Ben Witherington, oral texts. They are the substitute or a surrogate of the apostles' physical presence and authority in their midst. And the last thing to remember is that as Paul is writing not just Paul, but all the epistles, is that they are occasional by nature. And what that means is that there is a particular time and place, a reason for sitting down to write in the first place. And what that also means is that there is a certain depth of historical particularity to each of these epistles, where it's important for us to consider or to think about what was the occasion prompting writing an epistle like this, where there's a different occasion for writing that the occasion for writing Romans is not the same occasion for writing for the epistles for 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which is not the same as for Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, or Colossians, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's important to remember, to consider, to weigh what the occasion is for writing these certain epistles. So, but with all of that said, let's take a big picture look of the book of Romans, which I've said before is Paul's longest, most exhaustive and extensive theological treatise that is written to a church that he's never been before. He's never met a good many of the people who are in the church in Rome. And it's like Paul in the book of Romans is unpacking for us in extensive detail the theological significance of this thing that we call the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, and what it actually means. And so what that means also to remember when we are reading a book like Romans is that Paul is making a very long and elaborate argument that takes up the body of the largest body of the book, 3/4 of it approximately, so that by the time he starts in chapter 1, verse 18, all the way through the end of chapter 11, he is still stitching together and fashioning a cohesive argument in defense of this thing called the gospel that he's risked his life for. And so it's important then to remember that we're reading all of what Paul has to say as a cohesive unit. So that's one thing. It's also an important thing to remember that by this time, it's probably probably the case that Paul is writing this at the close of his third missionary journey, that he's already gone in a circuit throughout much of the known world and gone and visited and ministered to all of the churches and planted churches in the particular cities that he is intending to, whether that be in Ephesus or in Corinth or in Colossae or in Antioch or in any of these places, that the gospel has gone to seed. There are mature Christians in their midst who can assist Paul in his pastoral work so that the gospel can flourish among the people throughout the places that Paul has already been throughout these missionary journeys, and that he's got his eyes set on Rome and into the areas beyond Rome, namely Spain, and that he's still hoping he needs to be able to take the good news of the gospel to places that he's never gone before. And it's quite possible that Paul writes to Rome to shore up and to bolster the theological underpinnings, the solid rock of solid theological grounding that's necessary for this type of church that can be basically a new headquarters, a new home base, so that if he can establish himself in Rome, that he's going to have the firm standing so that he can take the gospel even further. That's a legitimate possibility behind what Paul is writing, or the legitimate motivation behind what he's writing. But it's also quite possible, and not least because Rome it's the capital of the Roman Empire, for goodness sakes, and that it's important that he invest a lot of pastoral energy in such a strategic place. And not least because, remember, as we had touched bases on, say, in last sermon on Acts 18, that what we also know about the church in Rome is that it's more than likely that there are still lingering hostilities between Jews and Gentiles, where there's a lot of controversy among the Jews, where that were incited by this person called Christ, or Chrestus, in the words of Suetonius. And on account of that, the Jews were all the Jews were expelled from Rome by the Edict of Claudius, and because of that, that means that the makeup, the cultural makeup of the church in Rome was predominantly Gentile. And you can imagine what things must have been like when the church is predominantly Gentile, and the Jews who had made their home in Rome are finally being able to come back to Rome, and that the that there's still a lot of healing and a lot of healing from hostilities of many years past that um, that Paul is wanting to address and to show or to demonstrate how the gospel can bring about healing and wholeness for Jews and Gentiles alike, where in order to address those types of hostilities and those types of problems, Paul is wanting to bring the whole church, Jew and Gentile alike, to grips on the gospel that has this life-changing, life-transforming power that is a message that the Jews and the Gentiles both alike need to hear. And so, with that, I'm going to give you a quick outline of what you'll find in Romans. That the greeting, what we're going to focus on today, is chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. And this is an outline that's also borrowed from Carson and Moo, and it's a rough and ready outline. There's a lot of debate as far as how it is that you would organize a book like Romans, but this will serve us for now. The next big section you'll find in chapter 1, verse 18, all the way through the end of chapter 4, is this the gospel as the righteousness of God through faith. And then the next section, beginning in chapter 5 through the end of chapter 8, is showing us how the gospel is the power of God for salvation over enemies like sin and death and the law. And that's the next step in Paul's argument. But then lastly, in chapters 9 through 11, is about the gospel in Israel. And what do we make of how we understand the relationship between the gospel and the covenant people of God, the Jews. And then lastly, in his final section, is the gospel and the transformed life. From chapter 12, beginning of chapter 12, through chapter 15, verse 13, where everything leading up to this point finally lands on practical application and saying, if the gospel is true and this is what it means, how does it affect how it is that I live? So 3 sections of orthodoxy that finally leads you to a whole nother section, a quarter of approximately of Romans, to practice, to orthopraxy, to right belief, where right belief leads to right behavior. And so, with that in mind, let's sit down and read this epistolatory greeting that is going to lead us to the thesis statement of Romans. It says this, Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. The gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures regarding his Son, who as to his human nature was a descendant of David, and who through the Spirit of holiness was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Through him and for his name's sake, we received grace and apostleship to call people from among all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith. And you also are among those who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. I'll pause there and reiterate. In the same way that Paul writes to these people in Rome, Jews and Gentiles, the message that was true for them is also true for us. That we, even today, are among those who are called to belong to Jesus Christ, which certainly tells you something about what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be a follower of Jesus, to be this thing called a Christian, that at bottom, it has to mean that we have this kind of belongingness to Jesus Christ that he has. If he is Lord, he has ownership and authority over our lives. And that if we're ever going to be real Christians and to be to bear the fruit of a life-giving relationship with Jesus Christ, it means that we have to come under submission to Jesus and his lordship over our lives. But let's continue. Verse 7, to all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be saints. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. God, whom I serve with my whole heart in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness, how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times, and I pray that now, at last, by God's will, the way may be opened for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles. I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are at Rome. And then here we're going to find Paul's thesis statement. That is, this is the main point, as succinctly as you can possibly articulate it. What he believes, his position, his argument, his defense, and that everything else that's going to follow after this is in defense of his thesis statement. It says this, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Let's read that again. And I want you to even a suggestion to do this is to, as you're going through the rest of Romans, is to write that down and to reflect on it even as you're going through the rest of the book, the rest of the epistle. And it says this, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Which is a big, challenging proposition, especially when most of us, we think even just practically about what we think about righteousness, is that righteousness has everything to do with action. And Paul challenges that, radically challenges that, how the sort of righteousness that God requires is one that is not through action, but rather through faith and through trust. And that faith is the thing that is absolutely necessary if we're ever going to not just achieve or to lay hold of in a real way the righteousness of God, but that the righteousness of God that is not merely his standard of righteousness, but the way in which God has actually done something in order to make the world right. If we are going to be a part of what God is doing, in order to be able to rescue the world, to save the world, to set things right again, that the the key for each and every one of us to that this righteousness of God is more than just a nice idea, but a reality. That this thing comes through faith. And the rest of the book is going to show how that is and why that is. So, thank you so much for joining us for Daily Devotions. I do encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel or podcasts so that you can follow along, and also that you can help support us in this church planting ministry here in Whitley County and Huntington County. And with all this said, I pray, look forward to the opportunity we'll be able to see each other in person again, and looking forward to just being able to learn and to live and grow as the people of God, and that we can grow even as the church in Rome did, in listening to what Pastor Paul has to say to us, and to encourage and to strengthen and nurture our faith in God, so that we can live as the people of God. So thank you so much. Take care, and God bless you. I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Take care.